Text for our lesson this morning. 2 Chronicles 7 and verse 14. If my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. You on occasion will hear that verse quoted on the radio and different things, and it's a very hopeful verse. But we've entitled the lesson this morning, Humble Yourselves. And Thayer defines the term humble as to assign a lower rank or place to a base. And humility, that's such an elusive concept, because you're working hard trying to be humble, and the moment you think you've got it, you lose it. And say, oh, see how humble I am. Well, that kind of is the end of that one, but we're going to look at a number of scriptures that talk about humbling. And the first one of those that we're going to look at is Deuteronomy chapter 8. We probably are all aware that Deuteronomy is a book that recapitulates the old law, the law of Moses. And Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 2, the scripture says, And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee in these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to provide or prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no. It took 40 years to cleanse the nation of Israel. But God tells us what the wandering in the wilderness was for. And that is, it was to humble them and to prove them to know what was in their hearts. Now, we all believe that God is omniscient, He's all-knowing. He knew everything before anything. And so He really didn't have to do it for Him because He already knew. But He did it for the people. The wandering in the wilderness was to humble them, to prove them. Then in verse 16 of the same chapter, Deuteronomy 8, the scripture says, it's God, Moses is speaking for God to the people, and he says, Who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee, to do thee good at thy latter end. It wasn't for God's benefit that they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. It was for their benefit to show them what they needed to do, what they needed to be. Then in 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 14, which was our text, we want to call your attention back to that. 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 14. If my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from the heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. We have this verse that tells us if we will humble ourselves, then God will bless us. And we have his promise then. He says, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. What's it going to take to heal the land? It takes a humble people. And God said, if you humble yourselves, I will hear from the heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. In 2 Kings chapter 22, Second Kings chapter 22, verse 19. The scripture says, because thine heart was tender, and thou hast humbled thyself before the Lord, when thou heardest what I spake against this place, and against the inhabitants thereof, that they should become a desolation and a curse, and has rent thy clothes, and wept before me, I also have heard thee, saith the Lord. You know, they had humbled themselves, and God said, because thine heart was tender, and thou hast humbled thyself before the Lord, then God said, I have heard thee. God is so gracious that all he asks is us to humble ourselves, right? He said, you humble yourselves, yeah, but there's a lot involved in that humbling of ourselves, and it's not always pleasant. But God hears when we humble ourselves. In Daniel chapter 10, Daniel chapter 10, verse 12. The scripture says, then said he unto me, fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand, and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. Daniel is to me, one of the most heartwarming books in the Old Testament. Daniel was such a firm, faithful person. And so many of the things that he did were just outstanding works of faith. And Daniel tells us here what God told him. He says, fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thy heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, and thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. God told Daniel from the very first day, you've had your priorities right. You set thy heart to understand and to chasten thyself before God. We, as his people, should follow the example of Daniel, of setting our hearts to understand and to chasten ourselves before thy God. And the idea of chastening himself is to humble himself. But Daniel and his companions are quite a story of faith. So we've seen that, God does what we need. God gives us what we need. Sometimes that's a long journey of 40 years on foot. And sometimes it's some other kind of chastening. But he always has a reason. God has given us a promise that he will keep when we humble ourselves before him. And as a result, the promise, part of the promise is that he will hear us and he will heal the land. But notice with me Ezra chapter 8. Ezra chapter 8. And I'm going to look at verse 21 when we get there. Ezra chapter 8 and verse 21. Ezra is speaking. He says, "Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might afflict ourselves before our God, to seek of him a right of way, to seek of him a right way for us and for our little ones and for all our substance." Ezra says that he proclaimed a fast that we might afflict ourselves. And that comes from the root of humbling ourselves. And Ezra was a good leader of the people as well. And here he proclaimed that fast. He set a time for the people to focus upon God and not upon themselves. He says he proclaimed the fast at the river of Ahava, that we might afflict ourselves before our God, to seek of him a right way for us and our little ones and for all our substance. They bowed down and worshiped God in their fast, and God blessed them for it. Isaiah 57. Isaiah 57 in verse 15. Isaiah 57:15, "For thus saith the high and the lofty, that inhabiteth eternity, whose name is holy, I dwell in the high and holy place, with him also that is of a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble, and to revive the heart of the contrite ones." There were those who were of a humble heart and a contrite spirit, and God set about to revive them. When we humble ourselves, God will revive us. Now, Sometimes we might get pretty worn out doing what we need to do, and we need a little pep talk, a little encouragement. God says, I'll revive those of the humble and contrite spirit. So how we should think is another blessing that comes from humbling ourselves before the Lord. In Matthew 23 and verse 12, the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 23, verse 12 says, And whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. That term abased, that comes from the same word as humble. That's one of the meanings we looked at just at the very beginning. Jesus said that if you exalt yourself, you will be abased, but if you humble yourself, you will be exalted. And that abased, of course, is to be humbled. So when we get haughty, prideful, God has a way to bring us low. And if you exalt yourself, he says, you will be humbled or abased. In 1 Peter chapter 5, First Peter chapter 5 and verse 6, the scripture says, Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. But a very plain admonition, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. Why? That he might exalt you, that he might raise you up, that he might encourage us. This humbling of ourselves is not all bad. It has its blessings, its good points, we might say. In James chapter 4, James chapter 4, verse 6. James writes, But he giveth more grace. Wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. The result of having a proper self-image is that God will give us grace. In verse 10 of this chapter, James says by inspiration, Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. When we humble ourselves, when we assign a lower value, a lower rank, if you will, for ourselves, then God will lift us up. We learn as we look at the scriptures that humility or humbling ourselves is the opposite of being humble. Is the opposite, I'm sorry. Yeah. Psalm 101 and verse 5. Psalm 101 verse 5 says, "Whoso privately slandereth his neighbor, him will I cut off. Him that hath a high look and a proud heart will not I suffer." God, we're looking at things now that are the opposite of humility. And he says, if we slander our neighbor, you'll be cut off. And a proud heart, God will not suffer. And the proud heart is the opposite of the humble heart. In Jeremiah 13, and verse 15. Scripture says, "Hear ye and give ear, be not proud, for the Lord hath spoken." The admonition to be not proud. In other words, be humble. And we find that God's blessings are found in being humble. Notice again 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5. First Peter chapter 5, verse 5 says, "Likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time." God's blessings are found in being humble, in humbling ourselves under the mighty hand of God. And then in James chapter 4, verse 6, "But he giveth more grace, wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble." God's promise, God's desire, if we humble ourselves, and his blessing is the gift of his grace. And then verse 10, "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up." There are two things I'd like for us to remember from the lesson this morning. Remember the hand of God on all who seek him for good. In Ezra chapter